Open the box in Edmonton, the colonel told me at my father's graveside. Show them his service number. They'll know what to do. The wind off the Ottawa River was cold that morning, the kind that cuts through your coat like it has somewhere to be. Beechwood Cemetery sits quiet even on ordinary days, but that Tuesday in November felt emptier than anything I had ever stood inside. There were no crowds, no receiving line, just me, a funeral director named Mr. Okafor, who had been kind enough to stay a few minutes longer than he needed to, and a man in a dark wool coat standing near the tree line, who I assumed was a groundskeeper until I noticed his posture. My father was a retired JTF2 operator. If you don't know what that means, most Canadians don't, and that was exactly how he preferred it. Joint Task Force 2 is Canada's special operations unit, quiet, unacknowledged, the kind of service that doesn't come with a parade. My father had served for over 20 years and never once described a single mission, not one. Growing up in Kanata, just west of Ottawa, I thought every family was like ours. That fathers came home tired and said little, that the word classified was a normal part of dinner conversation, that men simply didn't explain themselves. He retired when I was 12 and took a job with a small engineering consultancy that did contract work for the federal government. He drove a 10-year-old Subaru. He had a vegetable garden in the backyard. He called me every Sunday at 7 in the evening, never later, never earlier, and we talked about nothing much: the weather, what I was reading, whether the senators were going to embarrass themselves again. He never once mentioned his finances beyond saying he was comfortable. He never mentioned investments. He never mentioned Alberta. When he died, it was a stroke. Fast, the doctor said. He likely hadn't suffered. He was found by his neighbor, Mrs. Pelletier, who noticed his Sunday paper still on the step by late afternoon. I was in Toronto working as a policy analyst for a consulting firm when my phone rang. I remember exactly where I was standing beside the window in my office, watching the CN Tower go gray in the rain. My older brother, Mark, called before I had even arranged the flight home. "Is there a will?" he asked. Not hello. Not are you okay. I haven't looked yet, I said. He had that house, and whatever savings, we should get ahead of it. His voice had the efficiency of someone who had already started thinking about numbers. I told him I would handle it and hung up. The service at Beechwood was what my father would have wanted: short, honest, without decoration. The military chaplain spoke for 10 minutes. 3 men stood at the back of the room whom I didn't recognize. Older, straight-backed, the kind of men who don't check their phones. They left before I could speak to them. At the graveside, after the chaplain finished and the small ceremony concluded, I was gathering my coat when I felt rather than heard someone approach. The man from the tree line. He was in his late 60s, I would guess, silver at his temples, the kind of calm in his face that doesn't come from ease but from discipline. His coat had no insignia. When he stepped close, I noticed the small pin on his lapel, a rank I recognized from photographs. "Your father spoke of you," he said. I didn't know what to say to that. "He called you steady." He looked at the headstone for a moment, then back at me. "Open the box in Edmonton," he said. "Show them his service number. They'll know what to do." He pressed a card into my hand. Plain white. A phone number with a 780 area code and a last name Whitford written in blue ink. Then he nodded once and walked back toward the path. I stood there until I couldn't see him anymore. That evening, I went back to my father's house in Kanata. The place smelled like him wood polish, and that particular brand of instant coffee he had refused to upgrade from, despite my suggestions for the better part of a decade. His boots were by the side door. His reading glasses were folded on the kitchen table beside a crossword he hadn't finished. 7 across was still blank. Mark arrived the next morning without calling first. He walked through the front door and did a slow circle of the living room the way you do when you're estimating something. "Not much here," he said. "It was his home," I replied. "I'm just saying. The house is worth maybe $450, $480 given the market. We'd split it clean." Mark was 41. He lived in Gatineau and worked in commercial real estate, though his projects had an uneven history. There had been a partnership that dissolved badly 3 years ago. There had been loans, some from the bank, one from our father that I only knew about because I had overheard a phone call I wasn't supposed to. Our father had never mentioned it to me directly, but that was his way. He helped quietly. He didn't make it a story. "There's a will," I said. "We wait for the lawyer." Mark looked at me with the expression he had been perfecting since we were children, somewhere between impatience and something older. Something that had to do with being the first child and feeling like the second one had always been handled more gently. "You always do this," he said. "You always make everything procedural." He was procedural, I said. That's where I learned it. The lawyer was a woman named Claire Arsenault, practiced in Ottawa for 30 years, and she had handled our father's estate documents with the kind of thoroughness that told me he had given her clear instructions. The will was clean. The house came to me. A modest RRSP was divided between Mark and me equally. His personal effects were to be distributed at my discretion. A single line near the end of the document referenced an account and associated legal trust held with a financial institution in Edmonton, details of which were to be communicated separately to the named executor, me. Mark read that line twice. "What account in Edmonton?" he asked. "I don't know yet," I said, which was true. "Why Edmonton?" "I don't know that either." He leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. "Of course," he said. Not angry, just tired in the specific way of someone who has been waiting for a disappointment and has finally received it. "I called the number on the card that evening," a man answered. Calm, precise, mid-range voice. "Miss Tremblay?" he said before I'd given my name. "Yes, we've been expecting your call. When you're ready to come to Edmonton, please bring 2 pieces of government identification, your father's death certificate, and his service number. We can arrange everything from there." No urgency, no drama. The way people speak when they've done something 100 times and it has always gone exactly as planned. I told him I could be there within the week. He said that was fine. He thanked me and hung up. That night I went through my father's study for the first time with real attention. I had been in that room 1,000 times. It smelled like old paper and the cedar of the bookshelf he had built himself in the 80s. But I had never opened the lower drawer of his filing cabinet, which required a small key I found taped to the underside of his desk. Inside were folders organized with the care of someone who thought about the people who would eventually come looking. Tax returns going back 15 years. Insurance documents. Medical records. And at the back, a manila envelope labeled simply with my name in his handwriting. I didn't open it that night. I put it in my bag and drove back to the house I was staying at, and I sat for a long time in the dark before I fell asleep. Mark texted at 11:15. "Don't make any decisions without me. We should talk before you do anything." I put my phone face down on the nightstand. The flight to Edmonton was 3.5 hours. I had a window seat and I spent most of it watching the prairies flatten out beneath me, that enormous brown and white expanse that always surprises me how much of this country is simply space. My father had loved the prairies. He had done a posting near Cold Lake once, years before I was born, and he talked about that landscape the way some people talk about the sea. I hadn't opened the envelope yet. At the hotel the night before my appointment, I finally did. The paper was thick, the kind my father bought at a stationery shop on Spark Street every January. His handwriting was the same as it had always been, careful, no wasted motion. If you're reading this, I didn't get the chance to explain it the way I meant to. I had to put the letter down for a moment. I didn't keep this from you because I didn't trust you. I kept it from you because money changes what people think you are. I didn't want to be a number to anyone. I wanted to be your father. He went on to explain that after he left JTF2, he had stayed connected to a small network of men he had served with across different theaters, some in Bosnia, some in Afghanistan, 2 from a deployment he still couldn't name. Over time, he had watched several of those men navigate the particular suffering that comes after service. Operational stress injuries that the system called PTSD, but that didn't fully capture what had been broken. Bureaucratic delays in veterans' benefits that left families in genuine hardship. Medical needs that fell outside what DVA would cover. One man's son had needed a specialized surgery in the United States that no Canadian insurer would touch. So I started putting money aside. Not because I had a grand plan, because I knew what it was to watch men who had done extraordinary things struggle to pay ordinary bills, and I couldn't do nothing. The Edmonton institution was a private trust administered through a mid-sized investment firm that specialized in exactly this kind of vehicle, discreet, long horizon, structured to survive the person who created it. My father had opened it in 2005. He had contributed consistently, declined every opportunity to withdraw for personal use, and built in succession language that named me as the oversight trustee upon his death. The morning of my appointment, I walked into a building near the river valley that looked like any other mid-rise office, no grand marble, no imposing signage. The advisor who met me, Mr. Whitford, was the voice from the phone. 50s, unhurried, the kind of man who deals in significant numbers without performing significance. He walked me through it without theatrics. The trust held approximately $9.4 million in managed assets. Conservative long-term growth strategy, no aggressive speculation. Exactly what you would expect from a man who believed in showing up and doing the work and trusting time. Several Canadian and U.S. equities, some fixed income, minimal volatility. My father had met with the firm's advisor every 2 years, sometimes by phone. The beneficiaries were documented but anonymized in the summary. He showed me an injured veteran in New Brunswick who received quarterly support for home modifications after losing the use of his left hand. A widow in Petawawa whose husband had died by suicide 2 years after returning from Kandahar and whose mortgage had been quietly brought current 3 times. 2 children of a former colleague whose family had been in genuine crisis after a medical diagnosis that had wiped out their savings. I sat in that office for a long time without speaking. "This can't be right," I finally said. Not because I doubted the numbers. Because I was trying to place this against the man who drove a 10-year-old Subaru and argued with me about spending $14 on a bag of specialty coffee. "It's accurate, mister," Whitford said simply. "Your father was very consistent." "Did he ever talk about why?" "Once," he said. "He told me that people who do dangerous work for their country shouldn't have to fight their own government to survive afterwards. He said it wasn't political. It was just math." He slid an envelope across the desk. He left a secondary letter with us, to be given only after his death. My phone vibrated. "Mark." I let it go to voicemail. I opened the second letter. "You are probably wondering why I didn't tell you. The honest answer is that I didn't tell anyone not because it was a secret, but because the moment you tell someone about money, it becomes about the money. I didn't want this to become about the money. I wanted it to become about what it was built for." He wrote that he trusted me not because I had never made mistakes, but because I had always come back from them without drama. He wrote that the trust wasn't a gift. It was a responsibility, and he knew the difference between the two mattered to me. Mark is a good man who has been unlucky in some ways and careless in others. I don't say this to hurt him. I say it because you'll need to hold this with both hands, and you can't do that if you're trying to also hold him up at the same time. There is a family stabilization clause. Use it wisely. Use it with conditions. I folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. My phone buzzed again. I answered. "So?" Mark's voice was tighter than usual. "What's in Edmonton?" I looked at Mr. Whitford, who gave me a discreet nod and stepped out of the office to give me privacy. "Dad set up a trust," I said. "For us? For veterans and their families, people he served with." Silence. "And us?" he repeated, more carefully this time. "I'm the trustee." Another silence. "Longer. How much?" he asked. I told him. He didn't say anything for almost 10 seconds. Then, "And I get what exactly?" "There's a clause," I said, "for family support. Structured. With conditions." "Conditions." His voice had gone flat. "So he left you $9 million to manage and me conditions." "He left a trust to support veterans," I said carefully. "I'm responsible for overseeing it." "That's not what I'm asking." "Mark." "Don't," he said. "Don't do the calm voice. Just tell me straight. Did he cut me out?" I thought about the letter, about the word careless, about the loans our father had quietly made and quietly written off without ever making Mark feel small about it. "He didn't cut you out," I said. "He set boundaries." Mark hung up. I flew back to Ottawa 2 days later with a folder of legal documents, a USB drive with financial summaries, and a weight in my chest that I hadn't expected. I hadn't expected it to feel like this, not triumphant, not even particularly resolved, just heavy in the specific way of something that matters. Mark had retained a lawyer by the time I landed, a civil litigator in Gatineau who specialized in estate disputes. He filed a formal challenge within 3 weeks, citing lack of transparency in the original will, failure to disclose foreign and out-of-province holdings, and challenging the validity of naming a sole trustee without adequate notice to other heirs under the estate administration legislation in Ontario. It was orderly. It was painful. It was exactly what my father's letter had prepared me for. I hired a lawyer in Ottawa named Desmond Farr, retired military, sharp, no performance about him. He reviewed everything and gave me his assessment over the phone in about 4 minutes. "Your father was meticulous," he said. "The trust predates any claim by nearly 20 years. The will references the trust's existence without violating any disclosure requirement. There is no evidence of undue influence. This will go the distance if Mark wants it to, but it will not change the outcome. He just wants to know he mattered, I said. I surprised myself saying it. Desmond was quiet for a moment. That's between you and him. My job is the paperwork. The hearing was in an Ottawa courthouse with beige walls, and the particular fluorescent quiet of institutional buildings at 9 in the morning. Mark sat at the table across from me, and didn't look at me when I came in. He looked tired. He had always been better looking than me, in the way that people who carry their stress externally sometimes are. He had gotten thinner, and the lines around his mouth had deepened. His lawyer argued that the trust had been constructed in a way that effectively disinherited a natural heir without adequate disclosure or opportunity for contest. Desmond responded that the trust was a legal entity independent of the estate, properly constituted under Alberta trust law, with the estate will referencing its existence in compliance with all applicable requirements. No part of the estate had been concealed. No part of the trust had been improperly structured. The judge, a woman in her 50s with reading glasses and a manner I liked, immediately asked pointed questions of both sides and requested supplementary documentation. She adjourned for 3 weeks. Outside the courthouse, Mark finally looked at me. "You could end this," he said. "I know. Just give me something real, not conditions. Not a financial advisor babysitting me, something that acknowledges I was his son too." "You were his son," I said. "He helped you more than once, quietly, without making it a thing. Those were loans. He never called them that." Mark looked away. The river was visible from the steps, gray and wide, the kind of gray that November turns everything in this city. "He told you, didn't he?" Mark said. "Not a question. He wrote you a letter." "Yes." "And me?" I had wondered about that. I had gone through every folder, every drawer. There was no letter for Mark. There were records of every amount our father had given him over the years, not filed under debt, filed under a folder simply labeled with Mark's name. No annotation, no editorial. Just the numbers, kept carefully, the way our father kept everything. "He kept records of everything he gave you," I said. "He didn't label it as debt. He just kept it." Mark's jaw moved. "So he was tracking it. Or he was keeping it safe," I said. "So no one could question it. So it couldn't be used against you." He didn't say anything. "I think he was protecting you from the conversation we're having right now," I said. The second hearing brought the full documentation, trust certificates, 20 years of contribution records, beneficiary disbursement summaries, certified by the Alberta Financial Authority. Desmond presented it without flourish. The numbers were clean, the structure was sound. Colonel Arnaud, the man from the cemetery, submitted a written statement that was entered into evidence. He hadn't needed to do that. He had chosen to. In it, he stated that he had been aware of my father's intention to establish long-term support for veterans as early as 2003, that the plan had been communicated to him voluntarily, and that at no point had any party exercised undue influence over the trust's formation or structure. Mark's lawyer attempted to suggest that the colonel's involvement constituted an outside relationship that had shaped the trust in ways that excluded family. The judge's response was measured but clear. Awareness is not influence. The challenge was dismissed. Standing outside the courthouse afterward, Mark didn't move toward his car immediately. He stood on the steps with his hands in his coat pockets. "I feel like I lost him twice," he said. I stood beside him. I didn't rush to fill the silence. "You didn't lose him," I said finally. "You just found out he was bigger than we knew." Mark shook his head slowly. $9 million, he said almost to himself. He drove that rusted Subaru until the bumper was held on with zip ties. "I know. Why wouldn't he tell us?" I thought about the letter. "Money changes what people think you are. He didn't want us to love him for it," I said. Mark was quiet for a long time. 3 months later, I drove to Gatineau on a Saturday afternoon. Mark lived in a semi-detached near the park. Modest, comfortable, the lawn slightly overgrown in the way of someone who has too many things pulling at his attention. He opened the door before I knocked. He had been expecting me. We sat at his kitchen table. His daughter's drawings were on the refrigerator. She was 7, and her name was Sophie, and she had her grandfather's dark eyes. "I'm not dissolving the trust," I told him. "Not as an opening move, just as a fact we could build from." "I know," he said, "but the family stabilization clause is real," I said. It allows structured annual distributions for direct family members conditional on financial planning, debt reduction, documented progress. Mark looked at his hands. You want to put me on an allowance? I want to stop the cycle, I said. The loans, the next project, the next shortfall. Dad saw it. I see it. Sophie deserves better than that cycle. His jaw tightened when I said Sophie's name. Not anger, something more like recognition. I'm not incapable, he said. I know you're not. You've just never had anyone hold the structure steady while you worked. I paused. That's what I'm offering. He was quiet for a long time. Sophie's drawings rustled slightly from the draft under the door. What does it actually look like? He asked. A financial planner paid for by the trust, someone good, not a lecture. A debt reduction plan, 5 years. Annual distributions that increase as benchmarks are met. No lump sum, no blank check. Real progress. And if I don't agree? Then nothing changes for me, I said honestly. The trust continues. The veterans get their support. Life goes on, but not for me. Not for you, I said. He looked at Sophie's drawings again. A house with smoke coming out the chimney, the sun in the corner of the page, the way children always draw it. He should have talked to me, Mark said. Even once. He should have told me what he thought of me. He thought you were capable of more than you'd shown, I said. He just didn't know how to say it without it coming out as a criticism. Mark looked up. His eyes were wet, but he didn't seem embarrassed by it. That sounds exactly like him, he said. We spent 2 hours at that kitchen table going through numbers. What he owed. What it would take. What 5 years of steady movement could look like versus one more cycle of scrambling. It was not glamorous. It was a spreadsheet, and a legal pad, and 2 cups of coffee that went cold before we finished. But it was real. When I stood to leave, Mark walked me to the door. Sophie had appeared at some point, padding down the stairs in her socks, and she wrapped her arms around my waist without preamble. Are you staying for dinner? She asked. Not tonight, I said. But soon. Mark watched me from the doorway as I walked to my car. When I turned back, he lifted one hand, not a wave, just an acknowledgement. On the drive back along the Queensway, the lights of Ottawa came up slow and familiar. I thought about my father at his kitchen table on Sunday mornings with his crossword and his instant coffee, and the way he had always seemed so contained, not closed, just complete, like a man who had made his decisions and was at peace with them. 7 across had been blank when I found his glasses. I had checked the crossword before giving it to the funeral home with his other effects. The clue was, what holds when everything else gives? 7 letters. I hadn't been able to solve it standing there in the kitchen, and it had stayed with me all these months. Driving home in the November dark, it came to me. Bedrock. My father had been exactly that. Not the loudest thing in the room. Not the most visible. Just the thing underneath everything else that made it possible for the rest of it to stand. The trust would continue. The disbursements would go out in January, a veteran in Fredericton whose hearing aids the government plan wouldn't cover, a young woman in Trenton finishing her degree after her father's suicide had left the family without income, a man outside Winnipeg who needed a piece of equipment to get back to work after losing his leg. No press release, no gala, no named building, just steady. I had spent most of my life thinking my father's quietness was a kind of absence. Now I understood it had never been that. It had been exactly the opposite, a fullness so complete it didn't need to announce itself. Mark started with his financial planner in February. He sent me a text after the first session. This is humbling. Then, after a pause, I think that was the point. A year after we buried him, Mark and I drove together to Beechwood on a Thursday morning. No ceremony, no plan. We just stood at the headstone and didn't say very much. Sophie had made a small drawing that Mark tucked beneath a stone at the base, a man with his arms open, a sun in the corner. The cold came off the river the same way it always does. He would have hated this, Mark said. Us making it a thing. He would have come anyway, I said. Mark smiled, just slightly. The first real one in a long time. We stood there until the cold made it unreasonable to stay. On the way out, Mark stopped at the car and looked back once at the row of stones. He wasn't small, he said. No, I said. He never was. We drove back into the city, the river to our left, the Parliament buildings catching the morning light the way they do in November, gray and gold and entirely themselves. Not showy, just there, steady. If someone came into your life and did the work without asking for recognition, and you only understood the size of it after they were gone, I hope this story found you today. Call the people who have been steady for you, while there is still time. And if you believe the quietest lives are sometimes the most meaningful, I hope you'll stay with this channel. Tell me in the comments who in your life lived steady instead of loud. Because sometimes the most important things are the ones that never needed to be said twice.